Hello from the Barista Course Hamburg. Today we have what might be one of the most interesting grinders on our test bench. And if you've seen one of our recent videos, like the one on single dose versus grinder on demand, we explored whether there are any taste differences when grinding with a single dose grinder compared to a grinder on demand. Or maybe you've seen this grinder in our podcast featuring Lucas from the Brewspire team. That's a new project we're launching this year. We got the idea because we've met so many interesting people in the coffee industry over the last few years, and we'd like to introduce them to you, as many of them entered our industry from other fields, and their journeys are often very, very exciting. We hope you enjoy it if you're interested in that sort of thing. But now, let's talk about the brand new Mahlkönig E64 grinder. We've been testing it for about 3 months now, and our experience with it has been quite mixed. But why is it that this is now our new reference grinder? And why it might even become our grinder of the year, despite those somewhat mixed experiences we have had with it so far? Well, you will find out in just a moment. Why ambivalent? We've had some really positive experiences with this grinder, but also a few that aren't quite as positive. But the good thing about these flaws, in our opinion, is that they've either already been partially fixed or will certainly be fixed by Mahlkönig in the future, because it's actually just the software that we don't find quite as good in some parts. But more on that later. 2026 is going to be a very exciting year in the grinder sector, because many companies like ECM, Eureka, Rocket, and several others have announced new grinders that seem very interesting. Mostly these are so-called grind-by-weight grinders, which means they weigh the coffee grounds as they fall into the portafilter, so you don't have to weigh them beforehand, like with single-dose grinders, or afterwards. And that's super practical, of course, if you don't always feel like weighing every single bean exactly. One of the first grinders was a home grinder, but the relationship to the large commercial grinders is unmistakable. And whether it might still be suitable for the hospitality industry after all, we'll tell you in our conclusion. The designation E64WS is a bit cryptic, but actually quite simple. At Mahlkönig, the E stands for Espresso. This means the grinding discs are tuned for espresso grounds and, as Mahlkönig says, deliver their best performance there. The W stands for grind by weight, as I already mentioned just now. But you can also grind based on time with this grinder just as well. That means you program in a time and then it grinds the coffee grounds according to your programming. But then you have to weigh the coffee grounds afterwards. And the S stands for grind by sync. Maybe you've heard of that before. We were already able to test this grinder here at Host. Host is one of the world's largest, maybe even the largest trade fair dealing with the topic of the hospitality industry. And of course, grinders, espresso machines, and so on and so forth play a major role there. And Mahlkönig had its own event for this grinder and for the new Xenia machine. And the S, as I said, stands for grind by sync. This means the grinder can communicate with other machines. We can give the grinder a recipe, and if the espresso machine, for example, or the scale, there's also a scale coming soon from Mahlkönig. If they find that your recipe isn't quite working out, maybe you've ground too coarsely or too finely, then the espresso machine or the scale gives feedback to the grinder, and the grinder adjusts itself all on its own. But that also means that the grind setting of this grinder cannot be adjusted by hand, that is, manually but purely by motor. And that makes the grinder quite exciting. Grind by sync is still a bit of a future concept though for this grinder and other devices. There will certainly be more this year that will be very interesting, and we'll certainly make another film about this grinder in connection with, for example, the Xenia or the espresso scale from Mahlkönig. But let's maybe start with a few external specifications. It has a height of 39 centimeters, a width of 15.4 centimeters, and a depth of 21.8 centimeters. And it weighs about 8.5 kilograms. Currently, it costs 999 euros. And with that, it's pretty much right in the middle of the grind-by-weight grinders currently on the market. The grinder reaches an approximate volume of 78 decibels during grinding, and so it's in the middle of the pack. Some components of the grinder come from the Mahlkönig modular system, so to speak. The hopper, for example, is also used on the X54. I find it quite practical. I already thought so with the X54. It's actually very easy to detach. You have a slider here, you take it off, and you've got the hopper in your hand. There's just one small problem with it. As I said, we have this slider here. Let's see if you can see it clearly. And unfortunately, it moves very easily. This means if you don't hold the slider when removing the hopper or during transport, it can very easily happen that all your beans end up all over your kitchen. And that's not so great. And we've already passed that feedback on to Mahlkönig. It would actually be quite simple, I think, to introduce a small notch or a small hook here so that exactly that doesn't happen. And putting it back on is also very, very easy. Here you have these 4 screws which are used to lock the hopper in place. You just place it on top and lock it back in. And then we can move straight to the topic of cleaning because that's relatively simple. As I said, you take the hopper off here and then we see 2 screws here. You have to turn them 360 degrees, but you can't really go wrong. Unfortunately, our label here has already come off. And then inside here, I really hope you can see it clearly. We have a small, subtle marking for the locking mechanism here. Turn to the left, you open it. Turn to the right, you close it. So we reach in, turn it, and then we can remove the entire top plate. Then we can get to the flapper. I'll get to that in a moment. And we can also remove the upper grinding disc. That's also quite simple. Just loosen these 4 screws here. And once we've loosened up the screws, we can carefully take out the upper grinding disc. And now you can give everything a good clean. It's actually kept quite simple and easy to do, and we can't really do anything wrong. Afterwards, because we have clearly labeled which is the front and the back, you really always have to be very, very careful that the grinding discs are really very, very clean, that there's no residue here, because otherwise you'll have the problem that the machine can't really grind consistently. But that applies to all grinders. That means as soon as you clean a grinder, you really have to be extremely precise to ensure the grinding chamber is free of residue, that there are no more crumbs in between, so that the grinder can work properly. That works wonderfully. Now we put this back on here and lock it. And likewise, we'll go ahead and close this up again now, just as before. Using these 2 screws. And we're already done. We can even take out this little discharge chute here. It's the same discharge as on the single-dose grinder. There's a small bayonet here. You insert it, lock it, and then it's ready. And you might have also seen you can move this discharge a bit forward and backward so that your grounds land properly in your portafilter. And there's a small problem there, or rather, there was a small problem with the very first grinders that were delivered. And our grinder is still one of those very first ones. You can tell, among other things, by the fact that we still have 2 screws here. The new grinders being delivered now only have 1 screw to adjust the portafilter fork here, so you can adapt the height to your portafilter. I always find it a bit annoying that you have to do that with a screwdriver, and not like with the Eureka, for example, with a small knob that you can just loosen like that. You then change the height of this portafilter holder, and then you've locked it again. But that's because Mahlkönig says there are certification issues with those knobs, like on the Eureka. And that's something Mahlkönig places a lot of importance on. They come from the catering industry, and the rules there are perhaps even a bit stricter. And they told me there that they aren't allowed to use a screw like that. But Mahlkönig is working on it and wants to try to solve it differently for the home sector so that it's a bit easier. But that's not the point. I wanted to show you what problems we had while grinding. And the emphasis there is really on had, because Mahlkönig has recognized that there is obviously a problem, and I'll show you that now. So for that, I naturally have to fill in a few beans. And now we'll just grind and see what happens. I'll move this forward already. I think you can see that quite well. One of the big advantages of this grinder is this wonderfully fluffy ground coffee. And one of the big disadvantages of this grinder is the wonderfully fluffy ground coffee. Because this pile, as you can see, is so high. You always have a bit of coffee grounds lying to the right and left. It's not dramatic, but you just have it here on this small plate and on the portafilter fork. And that's a bit annoying. That's naturally one of the very first points of criticism that Mahlkönig received as feedback. And thank God they did something. But since it took a while for Mahlkönig to solve the problem, we designed a funnel in the meantime. And this one is adapted so that it fits exactly into this fork. And then we have the advantage that all the ground coffee ends up in the portafilter. A little tap and nothing more has spilled. If you're interested in such a funnel that we designed ourselves, we've had a micro edition made which will be available in our shop soon. If you're interested, you're welcome to order it there. So now we have everything in the portafilter that we want. Nothing spills anymore. But I just said Mahlkönig recognized that, or rather, the feedback was so clear that they reacted. The question naturally arises a bit, why didn't they notice that during the design of the grinder? Because the Mahlkönig representatives came by and brought us the grinder. We ground once, and I immediately tried to get it into the portafilter like that. And then they immediately said, oh, please be careful, there's a very, very sensitive load cell in here. You really shouldn't shake it too much. Treat it really carefully so that the load cell doesn't break. So the problem was there the first time. And that really makes me wonder, why didn't Mahlkönig recognize that during the development phase? And now they've recognized it, and now they have a solution for it. And we're trying that out for the very first time today without our funnel now. But that also means that we have to take the beans out again. And as you can see, we still have quite a lot of beans in here at the top. Of course, we first have to take them out or grind them all through. To do that, we naturally have to put the hopper back on. Or rather, there's a small sensor right here, a little button. It detects whether the hopper is in place or not. We're going to bypass that for now. I hope Mahlkönig isn't watching. So that should be enough. Now we're going to loosen the whole thing again and insert an addition to the so-called flapper. I'll explain what that is in a moment. I don't need to take out the upper grinding disc now. I'll just take out this flapper. This little flapper is there to briefly stop the grounds in the grinding chamber, to hold them back. And these few milliseconds are quite enough to discharge the statically charged grounds. That's the difference between single-dose grinders and, for example, grind-on-demand grinders. Mahlkönig has now found a solution to help prevent the problem of grounds being too fluffy. Specifically, they have an additional flapper that is inserted as an extra component. It's quite simple. As I said, I don't need to remove the grinding chamber. I take the normal flapper, put it in, and you simply slide the new metal flapper between the old silicone flapper and the grinding chamber. And this little plate provides an additional discharge for the grounds. This means the static charge is reduced even further, so that the grounds ultimately won't be quite as fluffy. And now we're going to try that out. And the good thing is, if you already have the grinder, you can get this small extra flapper from your dealer. They will give it to you. You've seen how to swap it out now. It's really super simple. And all new grinders will automatically be delivered with this additional flapper. So everything is nice and tight again. Let's give it a quick little clean. And now I'm very curious to see if the grounds change because of it. So we'll just toss that out, and now let's see if it works. Yeah, I should have pushed the outlet a bit further forward, but it's already become a bit less. I'll try it again. I've moved it forward a bit more now. That worked quite well, but I think I'll continue to use this funnel in the future because then I definitely have no more crumbs on the right and left. That's something that Mahlkönig has thankfully improved. The motor, by the way, is the same as in the X64 single-dose grinder. And it also has the same RPM, which makes the grinder, as you might have just seen, grind relatively quickly. In principle, you can't measure how fast it grinds because the problem is that if I have a very, very fine grind size, the grinder takes longer to get 18 grams into the portafilter. If I have a very coarse grind size, it's done in a flash. And in that respect, of course, the measured time it takes the grinder to get 18 grams or 10 grams or whatever into the portafilter is very, very relative. So really very relative. On average, we were able to measure about 13 seconds until the grinder had 18 grams in the portafilter. And regarding the fineness of the grind, there's another small innovation on the grinder. We'll show you that in a moment. The power button is at the back. That's something I personally find extremely impractical because for me, the grinder is very close to the back wall and then also sometimes or mostly even between one or two other grinders. That means every time I want to turn it on in the morning, I have to pull the grinder out, reach awkwardly behind it, we'll show you that in a moment, and turn the grinder on or off. But you can also switch the grinder to eco mode so that it consumes less power, but it's still around 2.4 watts that you then consume per hour. Especially in this day and age where we should really think about sustainability. That's not the best solution either. You can even reduce it a bit more. You see here we have an LED here, we can turn it on and off, then it consumes a tiny bit less. So that would be a solution. But what was new about the button? You see we have I don't even know what you call it, a circuit breaker switch on the button. That means if the grinder should ever jam, the motor gets too hot, then the fuse would trip. And you can now also here recently let it snap back in. That's something that we haven't needed on any Mahlkönig grinder yet. Even when we ground very, very finely so that we wanted a ristretto or something similar, we've never been in the situation where the grinder jammed and this fuse tripped. The fuse used to be inside the housing, but now it's on the outside. Personally though, I have to say I'd prefer the power button to be somewhere in the front and not at the back of the grinder. I guess that comes from the field of commercial grinders because they always have the power button at the back too. But in commercial settings, it's different because usually the devices are switched on and off via the fuse box and not necessarily via the actual on and off button. So that would be a request for improvement on our part. The grinder's housing is metal, by the way. It is powder coated and in typical Mahlkönig fashion, it is very, very high quality. You can't say otherwise. The only part that's made of plastic is this front area here, but there's a reason for that because the grinder has a Bluetooth and a Wi-Fi module. You can just leave it at that. And to anticipate the question, where is the grinder actually built? Is it assembled here in Europe or in China? It is assembled in China, specifically Mahlkönig, or rather Hemro, which is a group of different companies. That's Ditting, that's Anfim, that's Mahlkönig and Hey Cafe. And Hey Cafe is based with the factory in China, and that's where the grinder is also built. And then there's always very quickly the comment, yeah, that's Chinese junk. And we honestly can't confirm that because the quality of the grinder is good. And just because it comes from China, it doesn't mean that the quality is bad or it's cheaply built. I was in China quite often myself in my former job, and we visited many plants there from a wide variety of manufacturers. That was about 12 years ago. And even back then, the factories of German manufacturers in China were in no way inferior to those in Germany. They were just as perfectly organized, just as clean. The work there was just as fine as here in Germany. In principle, made in Germany just transferred to China. That's also the reason why Mahlkönig can offer this grinder so cheaply, let's put it that way. Because normally if this grinder were produced entirely in Germany, it would certainly cost around 500 euros more. The only thing, however, that is definitely made in Germany, specifically here in Hamburg, are the grinding discs. And we were allowed to take a look at the plant, and it's really impressive with what precision the grinding discs are made from raw steel. It's truly fascinating. And anyone who has looked into the subject a bit and knows their stuff knows that grinding discs are the be-all and end-all of espresso extraction. Grinding disc, grinding disc, grinding disc. That's really the most important thing, or belongs to the most important thing in the entire espresso game. There are two other points that I find very positive, and one is that you can readjust the scale. That means if something should ever shift, you have the possibility to recalibrate your scale with a weight like this. And you don't necessarily have to take this 1 kilogram weight from Mahlkönig, which costs 100 euros, but you can also use other weights. You can also adjust the grinding discs. The grinder helps you in the menu on how to get to the 0 point. And then there's even a small safety feature, which means you can set how much minimum distance the grinding discs should have from each other so that they don't accidentally touch and break. You can also monitor how long your grinding burrs have been in use, and the grinder will tell you when they are worn out. So that's it for now regarding the overall external features of this grinder. Let's move on to the topic of functionality. And in that regard, the grinder has a lot to offer, but it also has major weaknesses. I already mentioned it. The biggest weakness at the moment is the software. This weakness can be fixed, and we are quite certain that it will be fixed because we're in contact with Mahlkönig quite often about this, and they're working hard to optimize this grinder. You have to know a bit of the background that Mahlkönig is, as I said, primarily a commercial grinder manufacturer, and the home division of Mahlkönig has actually in recent years been somewhat neglected. There was always a grinder here, then came the X54, and now last year the X64 single-dose grinder. And that's kind of the new direction that Mahlkönig wants to take. They are currently setting up a dedicated department, and this department is very interested in significantly advancing this home grinder sector. They are currently scaling up enormously there, and the people I know there have a great deal of expertise in this field. But unfortunately, it hasn't been implemented yet. That will certainly be different in the future. And since the software is currently a bit suboptimal, I should say we won't go into it in too much depth, but we'll still give you a quick run through of it anyway. The good thing is, in principle, we simply don't need many of the things planned and already included in the software to be able to grind fantastically. Let's just go through it briefly. You have 3 buttons here. This is a jog dial, which we can use to perform various functions. Up here, we can grind manually. Depending on how long we press it, the grinder will keep grinding. But it's not weight-based, meaning it doesn't measure the weight in the portafilter, but instead automatically switches to the timer function. Down here we have the menu button, and we can already see there are various menu items. First, we have the settings level, which means when we turn on the grinder for the first time, we can configure the basic settings. We can connect it to Wi-Fi, we can go into the cloud. If you connect the grinder to your Wi-Fi network and the cloud, you also have the advantage that the software updates automatically. However, you will be asked beforehand whether you want to perform the update at all or not. Then there's an option to enter recipes. I'll get into that in a moment. We have notifications here. You see, we have a little warning here. That's because we don't have Wi-Fi here and it couldn't find the network. Additionally, we can adjust several things, such as the language. We can set up a welcome menu. We can adjust the brightness of the LEDs. We can also, of course, turn them off. We can adjust the color gradient of the LEDs. That means you can have them cycle through all the available colors here. And there's a kind of color flash, so to speak. What else can we do? We can activate and configure the standby mode. In doing so, we can also turn off the LED to save even more energy. Here too, we can set the LED color individually. Then there are some rather quirky things. And that comes a bit more from the professional sector, I would say, because it's not quite easy to understand what on earth does AGSA mean. I've had that explained to me in the meantime. I've just, to be honest, forgotten again what this ASGA stands for. It's a warning setting for when I want to change the grind size. And I'm adjusting it via a motor. I can't adjust it manually. I can show you that real quick. We've now entered our 18-gram recipe. I press here and see that I've set it to 32 micrometers. And now I can change that in single steps, and that's the fascinating thing about this grinder. And up here you can see the progress of the change, and that's really the fascinating thing about the grinder. You can set it extremely finely. But before I go into that again, let's go back to the menu for a second. And the recipe setting is quite interesting. You have the option to connect the grinder to the cloud. There's also a dedicated app for the grinder where you can look at many things more closely. And you can also activate the sync function there as well. We'll get to that, as I said, maybe in another video, and I'm sure we'll make another video about this grinder. At least once the software has settled in a bit, meaning once there are a few improvements, it'll certainly be very interesting to evaluate this grinder again and take a closer look. But let's take a look at the recipes. For example, we say we have a recipe here and want to grind by weight. We'd also have the option to grind by duration, as I mentioned earlier. But with this grinder, we naturally grind by weight. Now we say we want to set 18, 18.1, however many grams we want. That's supposed to be a double portion. We have the possibility to assign a portafilter. And with that, we naturally automate the grinding process. That means I can assign a specific portafilter to each recipe. As soon as I insert the portafilter, the grinder measures it and knows exactly, that's your double portafilter. So I'll grind the recipe for your double basket. This function can, as I said, be turned on or off and assigned. And that's something that comes from the professional sector and is actually quite practical. Then for the recipe we want to set, we can adjust the burr distance with micrometer precision. We can specify exactly what we want. Next, we could activate grind by sync. This feature only works with the corresponding scale, of course. Or soon with the Xenia espresso machine, which is now also part of the Mahlkönig lineup. So that's how it would work. Then we can enter the brew weight, meaning we just set how many grams go into the portafilter. And now we determine how many grams should end up in the cup, and we can adjust that accordingly. And here we have a small problem. Since the last update, we can't enter less than 40 grams for a double portion. And I think that's actually a bit of a shame. So an error occurred there, obviously, but that's supposed to be corrected. And now we can also view the recipe. Let's go back again. We can actually get some help with the recipe search. That means I'll go to the Setup Assistant. There's the Startup Assistant, which I mentioned earlier, but we also have the function to create a guided dial-in recipe. And it works like this. First, we select the beans we have. Let's say we have medium beans. We have a double portafilter. We want 18 grams in our basket. Then we tell the grinder our target weight in the cup, currently limited to a minimum of 40 grams for the double basket. And the next step would be to say how many seconds we want to extract our espresso. So if we do that, let's say 22 seconds, then the grinder will give us a suggestion for our grind based on this setting. But that's only a suggestion, of course. Once we've ground and then extract and find, no, that took 30 seconds, we can, as I said, tell the grinder, no, we didn't hit our target time of 20 seconds, it took 30 seconds. So the grinder will adjust itself accordingly. It won't necessarily work immediately for the grinder to find the perfect grind size, so that we have exactly our desired 20 seconds. It can always vary just a little bit. Maybe we'll have 21, maybe 19, depending. So the grinder gradually approaches our perfect recipe from grind to grind. But you could say it takes about 2 to 3 grinds to get exactly the result we want. And then we're ready to go. However, don't mistake all this for the grinder telling me when my espresso tastes good. That doesn't work, of course. You still have to find that out for yourself. Meaning, which extraction time, which brew ratio is best for you, what tastes best to you. You have to know that yourself, you have to find that out yourself. And of course it can't do that at all, because first of all it doesn't know which beans are in there, and secondly it can't judge when your espresso with your beans tastes best to you personally. That's it for now regarding the software, because there are still a few things, like the 40-gram limit you saw earlier, that are less than ideal. But as I said, Mahlkönig is working on improving and correcting all of that. And it certainly won't be long before this software is so optimized that we'll be filming a second video about this grinder. I'm very confident about that. What makes this grinder so special? It's the way the grind size is adjusted. You change the grind size with a motor. I already showed that just now. The tiniest micro steps. That means you might have different types of espresso and found a grind size of 37 micrometers for one type, and for the second espresso, maybe a grind size of 55. And if you ever switch the espresso, you can just jump right back to that setting. Of course, that doesn't mean the espresso will be perfect right away, but you are very, very close. And the fact that it's not perfect isn't because the grinder doesn't adjust perfectly, but because the beans might have changed. Maybe you drank the coffee in the winter before, and now it's summer, and there are so many factors that can drastically change the result in your cup. But because this grinder can be adjusted so precisely, you get back to your desired result very, very quickly. And the adjustment is incredibly fine. It's so fine that sometimes with a difference from 54 to 53 or whatever, you'll hardly notice a change in the cup. And that's what makes the grinder so fascinating. I can really determine very, very precisely what result I want to have in the cup. Of course, that's also subject to the beans. That means beans are a natural product. Not every bean is like the other. So, of course, every grind you have is also a little bit different. Please don't assume that if you say I had my 36 grams in the cup, the second grind will also be 100% 36.0 grams in the cup. It could be that you have a few tenths of a gram deviation or maybe even 1 or 2 grams. That's normal. The grinder can't help it and other grinders can't either. So don't be surprised. There's always a certain difference from grind to grind, or rather from result to result in the cup. But it's incredibly fun to use the grinder to change the recipe you have. And that is one of the big advantages of this grinder. And that's also one of the reasons why this grinder is currently the absolute reference grinder for us, because we haven't found a grinder yet that can be adjusted as easily and as finely as this one, at least in the home sector. When adjusting the grind size, you naturally also have to consider that so-called retention a bit. Up until now, we had only used the normal silicone flapper and not the new additional flapper, and so we'll have to do another test in a moment to see how much retention the grinder has. We'll take a break in a moment and continue filming tomorrow, then we'll have tested that. But with this previous flapper, we are able to determine a retention of about 0.6 to a maximum of 1 gram. And that is, of course, the reason why the grinder has to feel its way towards the perfect recipe a bit. Because if I say I've set it to 55 micrometers now and want to go a bit finer, maybe to 52 micrometers, then the grinder naturally still has about 0.6, 0.7 grams of old coffee grounds in the grinding chamber, which will then be ground out as well. And that's why the grinder naturally needs a bit of time to settle in. Now another 3 days have passed and we've thoroughly tested the grinder again regarding the potentially larger retention. Overall, we're now looking at an approximate retention of about 2 grams. So it's a bit more than before, and you just have to decide, do you want to install it or not? Now, of course, the question remains whether the taste changes because of the new flapper. Of course it doesn't, because the only thing we achieve with it is that the coffee grounds discharge their static a bit more, and as a result we lose a little bit of that fluffiness. We don't change the particle distribution, meaning the grain size and its distribution, and that ultimately determines the extraction and thus the taste. As mentioned, you can also grind out a little bit. We can even do that manually. We grind out a tiny bit, throw it away, and then we have no retention at all. But if I want to be 100% sure, of course, then I would just grind out a tiny bit. But that also applies in principle to all grinders available on the market. I'd say I'm thirsty for coffee, and first we'll make ourselves a delicious espresso. I'll take a very short break now because I naturally want to have a hot portafilter, but we'll start in a moment. Now our portafilter is hot and we can start grinding. We just use the help function. That means we have to confirm once more that we want to grind now. And here we go. And now you're about to see the following. That looks reasonable. That means nothing went wrong. So the new flapper helped. And now the grinder is asking us how our extraction process went, whether we really took 20 seconds, which is what we entered. Now we'll make our espresso first, and then we can enter that accordingly and see what happens. And that's the next reason why this grinder is our new reference grinder. Because the espresso, whether it's a light roast, a medium or a dark roast, we've been able to get excellent, extremely delicious espressos out of this grinder, or rather produce them together with this grinder. And we can tell it that now too, we really liked our espresso shot. And we can say now that we'd like to save it on slot too. And now it's saved our recipe, it's been corrected a bit, and we hope the next one will be even a bit more perfect. One thing to say about this adjustment method is that the whole thing is weight-based. That means I enter a target weight and I have to reach that target weight. Because as you just saw, the grinder asks me if I've actually reached my target. Meaning whether I extracted 40 grams in 20 seconds or not. And if I say no, I need 22 seconds, then it will correct that accordingly. I think it's a bit of a shame that this is currently the only way to adjust the espresso, or rather the grind size. Because if you have a time-controlled espresso machine at home, like I do, I currently have the Profitec Move there, then you basically have to set the time to a significantly longer value first, so that you can even reach your target weight, and then you correct it with the help of the time you've determined. As I said, I find that a bit of a shame because I'd like it the other way around, because I personally have my perfect extraction time for my coffee and I don't really want to change it. And I personally would rather have an additional setting option there. Meaning I have my 20-second extraction time, which I also inevitably achieve through the machine, but I only have maybe 30 grams or 40 or 50 or however many grams in the cup. And then I give the grinder feedback that I have too much or too little in the cup, and then it corrects in that way too. I personally miss that, but the other way is also no problem at all at the moment. And I want to emphasize it again, you don't have to use this whole function to be able to grind perfectly. You don't need any of that. You can adjust the grinder perfectly yourself, and since it's so finely adjustable, you'll get a wonderful result. And that leads me to the last point, namely our conclusion. As I said, we will certainly make another film about this grinder when the software has improved from our point of view. Conclusion, who is this grinder for? Is it good, is it bad? I think we've already answered that a bit. There are 2 points that make it the reference grinder for us. One is the espresso taste, which is actually fantastic. And the other is the ability to adjust it in an extremely precise and finely detailed way, allowing for very subtle changes. This means we can vary our grind size in incredibly fine nuances. And that's pretty much unique in the home grinder sector right now. I'm excited to see what else will come out this year. A lot will certainly happen there. There will also be other grinders that can adjust with a motor. And let's see if they can maybe even replace this grinder, or if they're just as good or maybe even a bit worse. We'll see all that, and of course we'll test them for you too. So who is this grinder for? For everyone who really enjoys setting their espresso as precisely as possible with a certain amount of leeway depending on your beans, for them I think it's definitely a very good choice. Of course, you also have to consider that it basically costs 1,000 euros. €1 more or less doesn't make much of a difference, I think. But for what the grinder does and delivers, and especially what it will be able to deliver in the future, it's a very, very fair price. I'm curious to see what price range the other grinders coming out soon will be in. There are a few disadvantages, which I think we've clearly pointed out. For one, there was the problem with the fluffy grounds. That has obviously been solved. As I said, we used it for the first time today, but it's quite clean around the grinder. So in that respect, that's a point we can already cross off the list. The software, as mentioned, will certainly be significantly improved in the future. And there's not much more I can really say about the grinder. There's maybe one more point we can mention. The question naturally keeps coming up. Is it possible to use SSP burrs, for example? In principle, yes for now, but Mahlkönig says no for now. But there will likely be solutions from Mahlkönig for that in the future too. That means they might offer other burrs or include them in their range. I'm curious about that. I've heard some rumors about it. That will surely please everyone who specifically goes for light roasts, or even just for dark roasts. One question remains to be clarified at the end. Is the grinder suitable for commercial use or not? I would say we'd rather advise against it. There are 2 reasons for that. First, commercial grinder motors are naturally much more powerful and designed for high volume. This grinder has a strong motor, but in our view it's not suitable for pulling one coffee after another, meaning you're grinding constantly and at short intervals. Short intervals would be the second problem. It doesn't have a built-in fan. Commercial grinders have that, so the burrs and the grinder and thus the grounds don't get too hot, because that would have a negative effect on the taste. So I wouldn't do it. If you have a small micro business though, meaning you have a throughput of, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 coffees an hour, then I could certainly imagine that you could use it. But in a normal commercial setting, I actually wouldn't use it. And that's it for now for this grinder, until we get to the next video with the next update. And if you'd like to know when one of our next videos is coming out or when our new podcast will be released, then we'd be very happy if you subscribed to our channel. By doing so, you help us a lot to make our channel much more visible, which in turn will help us in the future to maintain this channel. I thank you for watching. Stay tuned for the next video, stay tuned for the next Mahlkönig video, and whatever else is coming. Until then, we wish you well. Drink a delicious espresso. See you soon. Thank you very much for watching.